Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and we're back with another Lancer episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the Napoleon here, and happy holidays. Christmas just passed, and there was a bit of like a half-week hiatus here on the channel. So, that being the case, I hope you're all doing well. Hopefully, this next year we get more cool mechs, more cool TTRPGs, and hopefully the channel does a lot better. I mean, it did really well this year. I'm saying I'm hoping that we go even further beyond. But let's go ahead and talk about the Napoleon. So the Napoleon here is a defender controller mech. It's a size 1/2 mech. So this mech is just a dude in a suit. And this is a very interesting mech. And I'm going to be straight up front. I am not a huge fan of the Napoleon. I don't think it's bad. I don't think its concepts are bad, but I think generally how it works is very weird. So Napoleon is known as the indestructible mech. It is one of the hardest mechs to kill in the game. To what effect, though, is very different. It You'll see what I mean, but just know that the whole point of the Napoleon is it is supposed to be insanely hard to kill, and because of that, it tries to be really annoying. It's also like the shield mech in the sense that it has a lot of focus on use of shield abilities. So that's also very interesting and something you could say makes it a defender mech, but it's not a defender mech in the typical sense. This isn't the get behind me style defender mech. This guy deploys all of our shields and deployables kind of mech. There's a lot of other things that this mech can do, so let's just go ahead and get into it before I waffle around too much with this. All right, starting out with the stats here, we can see that the Napoleon does have a much higher than average armor of 2, though less HP than average of 6. Again, very typical in the game. The more armor you get, typically, the less HP you have. Now, something I should mention is the more armor a mech has, the more value hull has as a stat. As the more points you put into hull, the more HP you have. The more HP you have, the harder it is for you to kill, because the enemy has to get through your 2 armor barrier, essentially, before hitting your actual HP. Though armor piercing does negate this, so that's something you're definitely going to have to worry about when it comes to mechs like this one that are very heavily armored, especially because its evasion and E defense are just average, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that you are going to have to be careful when it comes to getting hit, and especially when the enemy is using armor-piercing rounds or is using things that can affect your mech, like tech attacks that can burn your mech out. Though, speaking on that, the heat capacity is actually really good. 8 heat capacity is a lot higher than average, so this mech is meant to be able to take a lot of punishment in a lot of ways. As we can see here, there is also actually a good use for heat in this mech, though good is, I think, very subjective. Regardless, sensor range is low. It's pretty much the bare minimum without being 0. That's not a bad thing necessarily. It just means that this mech is not designed for tech attacks. As a Harrison Armory mech, that's very much not unusual. Its tech attack is 0, so no special bonuses there. Its repair capacity is low at 3, but that's not bad because this mech shouldn't need to use a lot of repair capacity, but it does mean you can't get careless either. It also makes it harder with a variety of other things that use repair capacity, so something to keep in mind. The save target is actually good, being higher than average, meaning that this mech is pretty good at things like grappling, ramming, or the like. And its speed is 4, which is on the low end of average, still average, but kind of small. It makes sense for a size 1/2 mech anyway. And its system points is actually one of the very few mechs that have the straight average system points of 7. So overall, just looking at the base stats here, we get a mech that looks very obviously tanky, designed to be able to take things like damage and heat pretty well. It's not meant for tech attacks. It does need to be a bit careful with its low repair capacity, but it is meant to be in the thick of things with a pretty decent save, and it has a good amount of system points, so you're going to be putting a lot of systems on this mech. I would definitely recommend for the Napoleon investing a lot into your whole engineering and your systems. and that's a pretty big spread, but I can't really put any of those above the other. I guess hull would be my primary that I would select, just because to get the most use out of the armor and other features that this mech has, which very much benefit having high HP pools. Then it's either engineering or systems, depending on if you want more systems or you want more access to your limited systems, which, I'll explain a bit more here in a little bit, but let's go ahead and take a look at the frame traits. So frame traits are heavy shielding, a very good one. Whenever the Napoleon would take half damage on a successful save or check, it instead reduces that damage to 1. This increases the amount of survivability that this mech has. Now, I do believe when you become shredded, I know when you become shredded, you don't benefit from any armor or resistances. So shredded is something you have to keep in mind for this. But with heavy shielding, oftentimes you'll just actually take no damage. And Flash Aegis is another effect similar to this one. Whenever the Napoleon braces, it reduces incoming damage to 1 instead of gaining resistance. So overall, the Napoleon is designed, obviously here, to not take a lot of damage. Now, this isn't from primary damage sources. Like, save effects or checks that do damage on success are not very common, and they don't tend to do, like, a ton of damage. Same with bracing. Bracing is something you only want to do in a bad situation because it severely limits what you can do on your next turn. So these are not necessarily super good for average situations, but it does prevent the Napoleon from taking damage from, like, very unique or niche situations, or even in very bad situations when it comes to the brace. So overall, this makes the mech relatively tanky, but not in a very straightforward sense, which is not bad. I think it's very good. You can see here that despite being a defender mech, it has no guardian, and I mean, it wouldn't, because it's not big enough to provide cover to its allies. So this is one of the things that make it not a very good, like, get behind me style defender mech. And this is kind of one of the core issues I have with it, is just, it's a defender mech, but only kind of. And it's not really designed to be like a very big get behind me style of mech, but that puts into question, like, what is the defender quality? Like, what is it supposed to do? And that's mostly to provide barriers and such for the allies with some of its features. But its features don't really actually apply to that. It mostly just prevents itself from taking damage. Now, you could say that being a defender mech means that your mech is hard to kill, but that's not a role. That's just a quality of your mech. And so when you look at defender and what defender does, it's for preventing damage to your team, and you're mostly just preventing damage to yourself. So that being the case, it's not a bad mech. I'm not saying it's a bad mech. I just, putting it in the defender role seems very dubious to me for other parts, or for mostly just as frame and not for the actual license, which we'll get into. But it does have one weapon mount, which means it's not very offensively focused, but it is a main aux mount, which I actually really like the main aux mount. So yeah, I mean, one mount kind of sucks, but it's not a frame designed to do a bunch of damage. So main aux mount is not a very bad one. Now let's talk about its core bonus, or its core power, the True Black Aegis. So the True Black Aegis is a system that you use. It's quick action, you can see right here. And when you activate it for the rest of the scene, you are nearly impossible to kill. Let's go ahead and read it out here. So you reduce all damage except for damage that ignores reduction, which there's very few. I think there is the Pegasus's, like, gun effect that just does damage. So yeah, there's that. But other than that, there's not many other things that really applies to. So reduces all damage you take to 1. Has armor, which then would eat up the damage. Now, obviously, if it's armor piercing, then that you would take the damage, but then you're only taking a 1 to the damage. So that being the case, this is an insanely powerful effect. Now, something I should mention, and I think this is just kind of one of the problems with Lancer, is it's not exactly explained. So from my understanding, which could be wrong, not that it changes a lot of what I have to say about the mech in general, but what I could be wrong is when it says reduces all damage to 1, except for damage that ignores reduction. I don't know if this is like, so when you do damage calculations, first enemy totals damage. Then that total damage is reduced by armor, and then is further reduced by resistance, and then the rest goes to your HP. This reduction, this type of reduction, is not included in the general maths. So I don't know if this comes before, after armor, whatever. My impression is the design purpose is to reduce the damage as it's incoming and then have the armor hit it, making the Napoleon as indestructible. Even if that's not the case, let's say it's not the case, right? Let's say that this means that it doesn't take the mech's armor into consideration or resistances, or it's meant to take place after those for any remaining damage to 1. So that would make actually having armor on the mech generally not as good for the use of this particular system, which might be the intent. I don't know. 1 damage is not a lot, and like I said, if you invest in your hull, these 1 damage ticks are not actually going to do that much to you, because you can only really be attacked so many times in a round anyway, and there are ways to obviously get around this. But from my impression, based on how the game is showing or like presents the math, is this reduces the incoming damage to 1, which means that then the armor would just completely eat it up. And actually, you know what? I actually have here the maths for it. You can see here in calculate damage. It says the attacker rolls damage, applies any relevant reductions or increases, such as doubling from the exposure status. So this is why I would say that you reduce the damage, then you subtract armor from the damage, and then any other reductions or any other deductions from the defender are subtracted from the remaining damage. So this could be the place where the resistance is after armor, and this is why it's confusing. Because this doesn't necessarily imply attacker side, but this implies defender side. So if this is what's being taken into consideration, then you just take 1 damage. I don't know, because it doesn't give any good examples for this anywhere in the book, but I want to be very clear that I don't know, and the book doesn't offer any like actual answers. And maybe I'm reading this again, and maybe I'll change my mind. This includes reductions from resistance and any other relevant systems, talents, or reactions. So maybe this is post armor. If that's the case, then the mech is designed to take 1 damage if it takes damage at all, which I think is fine. It doesn't change my impression, but maybe I was wrong. Either way, maybe someone can let me know like an official ruling on this down in the comments, or they're just going to say, no, it's obviously this. And, you know, I'm just going by what's written in the book. And what the book says is I'm going to rule as this as this is post armor, so the reduction in damage is after armor. So that being the case, your mech is, from this point at least, going to be taking 1 damage, which is not bad. And if you have a ton of hull, like I said, you can only be attacked so many times in a round, and there are ways, obviously, that you can restore your health or whatever. There's also, you gain immunity to all tech actions, including beneficial ones, and any current tech effects on you end. So you just go completely blackout, which is pretty cool, but it does hurt when your allies are trying to assist you. But that's actually not a very big issue, because you can't do anything while in this form anyway. We'll get to that, though. You can only use systems with the shield tag, and any others immediately deactivate. Any other systems that require activation, or any systems that do not require activation, are unaffected. I don't know what that means, because like maybe it's a system that was like it gives you armor or something, but that's usually a core bonus. Regardless, if it doesn't require activation, you can still, I guess, benefit from it if it's like a passive effect. But you can't use systems anyway that don't have the shield tag. This is the hard part, and this is why I really struggle with this particular mech in general. You can't take quick actions, full actions, or reactions except for standard move, grapple, ram, improvised attack, activate shield systems. I gotta hide my camera for the rest of this here. Activate any kind of system except for those with the shield tag on them. Do a skill check or boost. So what this is really saying is the only things you can do in this mode is you can do your standard move, you can boost, you can grapple, ram, improvise attack, so you can't skirmish or full barrage. You can only activate systems with the shield tag, and you can do skill checks. That's it. So generally speaking, if you want to attack your enemy, you're going to have to bash them with your fists and not use any weapons while doing so because you can't skirmish. It's only the improvised attack action. You can't overcharge, so no getting additional actions on your turn. And you can't use comms to talk to other characters as sound doesn't exit the shield. Now, you can still receive statuses and heat and can be affected by involuntary movement. You can otherwise interact normally with the world, including picking up and dragging items and so on. So this is a very weird core power because I don't know when you would use this other than things have gone really, really bad and you need to escape. Because, I mean, you could still run up and grapple enemies. You could be like a sacrificial pawn in a lot of plays because you can just take the beating. You can go grapple an enemy so your allies can blow it up with, bombs, explosives, whatever. You can do all kinds of things, but that seems very limiting, and there's other better ways to do that in the system without necessarily putting your mech at risk. This is just designed to make your mech very, very hard to kill, which I don't think is a bad power, but you then need to be able to do something. And improvised attacks are not super great. I think there is a talent that can specialize in that, but even then, I don't know. Like I don't know what the purpose to this is other than just to make your mech harder to affect. You can still be stunned. You can still be affected by various statuses in this effect, which is very bizarre to me because then what actually is the benefit, other than you're just hard to kill? You can be affected by tech actions, but your mech is not very well designed to take, so that covers one of your weaknesses. Sure, but still, I don't know. I'm just not sure. And to be fair, no mech should be based purely on its core power, as the core powers are meant to be used sparingly anyway. But I just find this one very strange. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting, but I don't see the actual purpose in it. And this is what makes it kind of hard to build around, as it's like, what can I do other than now I'm just a mech that runs around and deploys shields or use shields abilities. That's very hard to deal with, which I guess can be annoying, but that takes this should be a support like mech, really, more than anything. I don't know. It's very interesting. Maybe y'all will let me know in the comments. But let's go ahead and take a look at the license and see what else we can get out of it. All right, first up is Stasis Bolt. This is actually a really good 1-point system, though it is something that consumes 2 actions. So it requires it to be charged using a quick action and then a reaction to actually use the effect. So essentially what it is you charge your Stasis Bolt and you now gain a reaction. This reaction is triggered when you or an ally is targeted by a range attack. The ally can be no more than 5 hexes from you. So when either you or your ally are targeted by a range attack, you make a contested attack roll, which I think is really fun. And the attack, if you win, the attack automatically misses. Sorry. And the Stasis Bolt, there you go, loses its charge. So this is a reaction designed to help protect you and your allies. This is very Defender-esque. I definitely think this is very much worth the use. And you can do this with the Napoleon in its Black Aegis, true Aegis mode, that you can, you become very hard to kill, and now you can shoot out shots from the sky. This is better against situations where you're going up against like a few enemies, or you have one very nasty enemy like a backline artillery mech that's doing massive damage. But it does say targeted, which means it doesn't work on anything that has a burst effect. So that, or it covers any kind of area. So yeah, this is really good. I really do like this one, and the fact that you can use this in your Aegis mode does make you just a really good defender mech. I'm definitely not saying that the Napoleon can't be useful in some situations. So this is one attack using a reaction, and it consumes a quick action, which is a pretty heavy cost for the effects. Worth it, I'll say, but definitely very heavy. This is actually really good to pick up on other mechs as well. If you have another defender mech that you're using, this is actually a very solid, like, first rank pickup. So overall, I actually really like Stasis Bolt. Next up is the Stasis Generator. We can also see here another shield tag. So something we can also use in the Black Aegis. This is a 2-pointer, and you can activate it as a quick action. You choose a hostile character or willing ally character within line of sight and range 5. Until the end of their next turn, they become stunned, but they also gain immunity to all damage and effects, and can't be moved, targeted, or affected by any other character or effect. This can be used on each character once per scene. Hostile characters can succeed on an engineering save to ignore this effect. This is a very good tool, mostly to take an enemy out of the combat. One of the best ways to conquer a battlefield is to segment off enemy troops and take down the remainder while you have the superior firepower. So then when you re-engage with the remaining force, you can then take them with a higher advantage. Stasis Generator does exactly this. Now you do have to be relatively close, range 5, which is not very far in the scope of the game, but you're playing the Napoleon typically, so you're going to be running in and really hard to damage anyway. So this is actually not bad for taking an enemy off, though it does kind of suck that they can just use an engineering to remove the effect. Granted, I guess it would be too powerful if that wasn't there, but they can only be targeted by this once. It does not say, I guess it says this can be used on each character once per scene. I don't know if that means targeted or actually affected. That's some bad wording that needs to be rewritten, I think, because that can be confusing. Because my assumption is they can only be targeted by this once per scene, which would make sense. But if you could keep doing it on an enemy that makes it saves, that seems really annoying, but I don't know. So, yeah, the only time you'd use this on an ally is if you're in a situation where you know something is about to go very terribly wrong and you need to quickly act to make sure they don't die. That's not saying that this actually can't come up, and this has a lot of good narrative story implications, but when you're using it on your ally, you're just essentially taking that ally out for a round. Now, they can't be affected by any other character, so you can't even use this as kind of like a temporary stop to allow another ally to run up and heal them, because they can't be healed until their next turn anyway. So this is mostly a zoning tool. This is where the controller part of the Napoleon comes in. I think this one's pretty okay. The ability to take an enemy out of the combat for a round is really good, and I think is something that has a lot of potential. But I feel like there's a lot of situations where this might not be super handy. I do like it as a zoning tool, and as a rank 1 pickup, it's actually really not that bad. So overall, I'm going to say that this is a generally good one. Even though I'm kind of mixed on it personally, I think that this has a lot of really good implications. It's just hard to say whether, and again, this gives you a way to affect enemies in your true Aegis, which is very good considering that you are very limited in that form. So yeah, I'm going to say this is good. I'm going to say it works really well for the Napoleon. That I'm just saying that it's very niche in a lot of ways. And once you affect everyone that you would affect with this, then it becomes useless for the rest of the combat. I don't think that necessarily will happen. Like most time, by the time the combat is ending, it's not going to be an issue. But I don't know. Like I said, I think it's good. I do think it's actually good. All right, at rank 2, along with the Napoleon, we get the Phase Ready mod. Actually, one of my favorite mods in the game. It's really cool, though it's a bit conflicting. Okay, so it's a two-point weapon mod that you can put on pretty much any kind of weapon, which is really good because there's some really good mods out there. This one also super benefits snipers because this one, it says, as long as you know the rough location of your target, The weapon this mod is applied to can attack through solid walls and obstructions, doesn't require line of sight, and ignores all cover, but targets attacked this way count as invisible. So this is a really good way to snipe or hit a target that's behind cover, that's behind something that that can be passed through. That I say that as a stipulation for something we're going to get to later. And then the target just gets a 50-50 chance whether they're hit or not. Now, this isn't good for negating cover, because cover can give 1 to 2 difficulty, which is the best result of a d6, depending on how much difficulty you have. So 1d6 for 1 difficulty, 2d6 for 2 difficulty. You get a max of 6 or a minimum of 1. Or a 50-50 chance. So I would say the difficulty is probably more often than not worth it compared to something like invisible, which gives you a 50-50% chance of missing, because statistically speaking, you're probably still far more likely to hit even with the cover, especially with bonuses, your grit and everything, applying as bonuses to your attack, which directly counteract the effects of difficulty. So this is mostly used to hit enemies that are like not in line of sight, behind a big building, something that doesn't provide necessarily cover, but instead is just a full obstruction, all that kind of stuff. You still need to know where the enemy is, so you can't even use this when you're like approaching a base, for instance, and sniping people out. You have to have some way of detecting them. There are ways around this, of course, but not found in this license, which is important to mention. I like this mod. It's really fun. I think there's a lot of ways that this can be used very, very well. But it is a catch-22, because while you can affect enemies that you don't have line of sight to, they are counted as invisible, and you have a really good chance of not hitting the target. Granted, just as much as you are hitting the target. I don't know, honestly. This is a very good one, but like I said, it's somewhat conflicting because of the invisible advantage that the enemy gets from your attack. Like, this isn't even designed to get through cover. This is mostly designed to get through full-on blockage to your line of sight, which, is still good, but still, you're still not at, like, super likely to hit the enemy. You're not more likely to hit than you are to miss, and that's why it's kind of a hard take for me personally. But I do like this mod. It's one of my favorites, and I think there's a lot of really good things about it, but, I've aired my grievances. Whether you like it or not, I think this is a good mod. All right, also at rank 2, we get Stasis Barrier. This is actually one of the best barrier deployers in the game, and it's actually really good. So you create a barrier that's a 4-line and 4 spaces high, which is actually really high. Most mechs, actually any mech that isn't flying, cannot shoot over this barrier, which is important to notice, unless I guess they're on like some kind of terrain piece or something. But 4 spaces high is actually really, really high. So, and a 4-line is actually pretty long too, considering for any kind of barrier. So what this barrier does is it counts as an obstruction and it provides soft cover, but it doesn't block line of sight. So it's some kind of energy barrier that the enemy can see your allies through. When an attack is made against a character that is benefiting from the barrier's soft cover, they need to roll a d6, and on a 4 or higher, so a 50-50, the attack is consumed by the barrier and has no effect whatsoever. The barrier lasts for the rest of the scene or until you deactivate it as a quick action. This effect does not stack with invisible. Now, I will make special mention. This one does not say when you deploy another one, it goes away. In fact, it's actually limited, which means once you set it, it's set. But if you invest in engineering, which I did mention earlier is one of the things you might want to do with the Napoleon, you can actually get multiple stasis barriers. And one of the great benefits of stasis barriers is an ally can move out cover, shoot an enemy, move back into cover, and be pretty safe. This essentially gives any allies behind it invisibility, except that they can be seen. So that's actually really powerful. It's really, really good. And even if the enemy hits you, you're still benefiting from soft cover, so they still need to get past a singular difficulty in order to get by it. And as long as the character is benefiting from this, even shots that might negate invisible or negate cover will still need to roll as if you were invisible with a 4 or higher, consuming their shot. Overall, I say this is really, really good. And this is one of the parts that's like, yeah, the Napoleon does have defender qualities. Stasis Barrier is really, really good. Stasis Bolt is really, really good as defender abilities. So, definitely has defender qualities. I don't know. I'll talk about it in the end when we get through the rest of the license. But I do really, really like Stasis Barrier. I think this is a really good deployable. We're on to rank 3, and before we get into that, let me just say, if you're enjoying this content, leave a like. It helps other people see the content, and you might want to subscribe, as I do 2 Lancer videos at least a week, or I try to a minimum 1 a week. And as well, we cover all things tabletop here on the channel. So if you're enjoying the content and you like tabletop in general, this is probably the channel you want to be on. Let's go ahead and talk about the Displacer, though. So the Displacer is an insane weapon. It's very much a weapon I could see being on the Napoleon, honestly. This is insane because it's a range 10 blast 1, which is pretty good. It's a main rifle, and it does 10 energy damage. And let's talk about it, because there's a lot of other cool things here. It's also armor piercing. Rough. If you hit someone with this, there's a good chance that they're going to be taking a structure damage. That's insane. Now, it is a loading weapon, so you do need to spend an action reloading after your fire. The amount of damage, okay, this still seems very good. Even with loading, this seems like an actually abnormally good weapon. So what's the catch? This part right here. Heat 10 to yourself. This is the highest heat of anything, any system, I think, in the game that you do to yourself. Heat 10 is insane. Now, the Napoleon starts off with heat 8. So, the Napoleon, if they fire it at base, would take a stress from this. That's not good. Now, granted, if you're investing in engineering, increasing your heat capacity, there's a good chance that you could survive firing this gun once. Not again, but you could do it once. And there are ways, of course, you can build yourself to restore a lot of your heats to vent it very easily. So it's actually not bad if you have the heat capacity to use it. Granted, it's also loading, so you do need to make sure that you're spending extra actions to load the weapon up. But otherwise, it's actually not terrible. This is a very interesting weapon. I don't know exactly how I feel about it, because this weapon feels super swingy, but I think that's kind of the point. And what I mean by swingy is, first of all, you have to hit the enemy first. So you have to hit the enemy, or they have to be in the blast area, which is not hard. And then you need to survive the heat, and then you need to reload the weapon. But if you hit an enemy, they are going to take a major damage. The armor piercing is really, really good. This is the bane of heavy armor mechs everywhere. This is a very fun weapon, but it's also very much a double-edged sword. Because the Napoleon itself, in its true Aegis form, well, first of all, the true Aegis form does not prevent you from taking heat. So you're already very victim to taking stress after firing this weapon. You can't even fire this weapon when you're in your true Aegis form anyway. So this is one of the things where it's just like, okay, I fire as a skirmish and then I true Aegis to prevent myself from like taking too much after this. Well, wrong, because you're still going to potentially take heat damage, which could stress out your mech. It's a good weapon. It's very much great for gamblers, great for people who want to take the opportunity. The blast one is really good if enemies just happen to be lined up. I think this is a very fun weapon, but it's very dangerous to use. So it's very, very interesting. And the final system we have here is Blink Shield. You can also see it has shield. It has shield name, so obvious. And it's a full action, and it just creates a dome that separates your area from the rest of the battlefield. Like, they're no longer considered the same battlefield. So essentially, what happens is you create a burst 4 bubble, which is pretty big, around your mech, in which the flow of time is altered drastically, which doesn't make any sense considering it does say that time flows normally on both sides of the bubble. And essentially what happens is it's impregnable. This is immune to all damage. You cannot draw a line of effect through it. And not even light passes through it, even though I think it's assumes that light is still on the inside of this blink shield. Like, it doesn't say that it goes dark, but I guess maybe that's just not a thing in Lancer. Like, maybe darkness isn't a factor because your mech can just have lights or whatever. But yeah, so essentially what the blink shield does is it creates this space that just zones out yourself from everything else, or yourself and whoever is in the barrier. Now, if any character is partially within the affected area, they need to make an agility save, and on a success, they get to choose whether they want to be in or out. But on a failure, the creator of the blink shield chooses. So, in or out, depending on what the situation necessitates. Now, this is stationary, but it only lasts until the end of your next turn. This system also does 4 heat to yourself, which is insane. That's an insane amount of heat. For honestly, I don't know what a benefit is other than potentially keeping yourself out of enemies like harm. Like, this is a really good ability. If you get shot really, really hard and you're like, oh no, I need to take care of this, you can then, create a shield and then heal yourself on your next turn. And then at the end of the turn, the shield goes away. And then, I don't know what that necessarily would do, but I guess it would prevent you from taking any other fire if enemies are closing in on you. The core thing I think this is supposed to do is you're supposed to run in as the Napoleon, create this barrier, and then with an enemy with you, you can then duke it out for a round. You have to overcharge to do something, and until the end of your next turn, the enemy is stuck here. They can't get away. They have to deal with you. You're a Napoleon. You're insanely hard to kill. That doesn't sound like a very fun effect to deal with. And this is potentially a really good zoning tool. But you can't sustain it. It lasts until the end of your next turn. So after your next turn, the shield will drop and you won't be able to create another one until your next turn. And not only that, but creating them does 4 heat to yourself, which is something that you might not be able to do a ton. So I think this is very fun. I think this is very interesting. I think what it does is something that can be worked with, like, with a great amount of ingenuity. But I feel like the main effect, like take an enemy out of the combat, for instance, you can kind of do already. And it's not even good as like set up a you and me dueling arena kind of thing, because you only get 1 round to actually like deal with them. And you can kind of do that anyway, because like, let's say for instance, you use the Stasis Barrier, I think, from the very first rank. You hit the enemy, they fail their engineering, they're stuck there, you run over, and then the next enemy's turn ends, they're no longer stunned, but they can't do anything else, and you can go over and attack them. So it does the same thing without creating a bunch of heat for yourself, actually. So on that purpose, yeah, I don't know. This can also be a really good way to give your allies some breathing room on the combat field. Like, I think that there are some ways you can use this, as I said before, in a very ingenuitive way. But it's not very clear what the actual intent behind this is, other than just creating a quirky black, shield that enemies need to try to work around, get in, or need to do something, when you're in it. So yeah, and it always affects you. It's a bubble around your mech. So your mech, good or bad, is always inside the barrier. I did a run with the Napoleon, and actually this is a good point to kind of like talk about this now. So I did an actual battle with one of the enemies being a Napoleon. I called the enemy team the Death Reactors. Very fun fight. And the Napoleon's job was to run over to take out the player's heaviest hitters and just go into the barrier, pull up the Aegis, and just wastes their time inside this barrier. That was kind of the whole point. And the problem was that the players were using, one of them was a Genghis, which was probably not the enemy's best choice, honestly. But that's okay, because the players are supposed to be able to win. Regardless, the Napoleon did do exactly that. The Death Reactors lost in the end, but the Napoleon did stall the players quite a bit. And that's kind of where I think the Napoleon is strongest. It's a very annoying, insanely hard to kill mech that at most ever takes 1 damage. And you know what? I actually started this building with like the wrong impression of how the damage negation works, but I think I actually did it right in the live play, funny enough, which is very interesting. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where I think the Napoleon's interesting. If you are a player who likes to troll the enemy team, the Napoleon's probably the mech for you. I think it has way more downsides than it has upsides. Like the Napoleon frame itself is generally tanky, but it doesn't have a lot of weapon slots. The frame itself, unless you're taking shield stuff, actually can't do a whole bunch. And so you are like forced to take shield abilities. That's not necessarily bad. Obviously, it's like if you want to play a shielding mech, you want to play the Napoleon, right? But then when it comes to its shielding abilities, it's something that can, like Stasis Bolt can negate 1 attack. Okay, that's good, but a big defender mech in front of an ally can just constantly provoke, prevent or creates 2 difficulty with hard cover or soft cover or the like. While Stasis Bolt has a chance of negating 1 attack. Then you look at Stasis Barrier. This is a really good placeable. I'm going to say it's a really good placeable, probably one of the best placeable defenses in the game. Sure, of course. But that's generally it. Blink Shield itself, right here, is something that is very hard to utilize well, because you create a burst 4 bubble around you and someone else. Obviously, the best thing you can do for your team typically is to run up on the enemies and use this while they're having a hard time dealing with you. Then your allies can set up, do whatever. But, it does a decent amount of heat, and if the enemies are capable of heat, then that's not a very good strategy to utilize. So, I don't know. The Napoleon has a lot of fun pickups, and I think the Napoleon license in general is really good if you're just picking up things from the license. Hell, the Displacer, I think, is insanely fun, but it's also just very wonky and very risky to use. I think it's fun and worth the pickup, but the Napoleon in its basic design is not really meant to sit around and attack the enemies. It's supposed to be very tanky and defend the allies, so the weapon feels very out of place. It works because the Napoleon can use it in a way where it can avoid some of the consequences by then just popping its black Aegis. But then, I don't know. I'm very conflicted on this mech, to be honest. I'm not gonna say it's a bad mech. I'm not even gonna say it's a mid mech. I think it can do some very interesting things, but it might just be a little bit too 5-head for me to figure out, you know what I mean? It seems like its uses, it's very hard to utilize very well for I don't know what effects. Like there's some mechs are just like you can see, oh, it's very difficult to use, but when you can use it, you have really cool things you can do. This mech is like it's very hard to use, and at most I can see being able to take an enemy out of the combat for like a round, which other mechs can do and better. And saying, oh, well, the stasis barrier is at least good. Yeah, sure. But anyone could use the stasis barrier with 2 ranks in the license. It doesn't have to be the Napoleon frame. So the Napoleon frame, its biggest quality is just how hard it is to kill. But you want a hard to kill mech when it does something that killing it becomes a necessity, like it's damaging enemies or something like that, and they want to kill it because they'll die otherwise. No, the Napoleon frame is like, I'm going to defend my allies and be very hard to kill. And while that's annoying for sure, it only has one effect it's actively doing with Stasis Bolt, that it is consistently doing that. Otherwise, it's not that much of a menace. And honestly, how my players defeated Death Reactor in the first place was mostly just ignoring the Napoleon, which does make its job as the defender kind of pointless when they're just not shooting the indestructible mech, because why would you? So I don't know. Napoleon is very strange, but let me know what you guys think. I know this is a longer video than normal. A lot of rumination on this one for me personally. I do think it's not a bad mech. I don't know where this would be a very hard mech for me to place on a tier list, honestly. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.